Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
Today, we are taking on a pretty significant structural analysis. We're going to be looking at the invisible architecture that holds a society together, and more importantly, what happens when that architecture begins to buckle.
Right. We are conducting a long-form deep dive into the source material, The Common Good by Robert B. Reich. And I want to set the stage immediately because, usually when people hear a phrase like the common good, they glaze over a little bit.
Oh, absolutely, they do.
They think of something soft, they think of charity or just being nice or some vague sense of community spirit, like something you'd hear in a high school commencement speech but totally ignore in the boardroom. But that is absolutely not what we're doing here today.
No, not at all. And we should clarify our approach right out of the gate. This is not a book review. We aren't here to critique the author's prose or debate the historical anecdotes. We're treating this text purely as a systems-level institutional analysis.
Which is exactly what we do here. Books are really just entry points for us.
Exactly. We are looking at the common good, not as some moral aspiration, but as a piece of hard infrastructure. It is a substrate. And without it, democratic capitalism literally cannot function.
I really love that framing. We talk so much about identity in our culture today, who we are, what we believe, but the lens we're using for this deep dive is that identity is actually a reflection of systems.
Right, the system dictates the behavior.
Yeah, if the system is designed to reward selfishness, we become selfish. If the system is designed to reward cooperation, we become cooperative. So our mission here is to trace the erosion of public trust, not as a moral failing of individual people, but as a design flaw in the institutional architecture itself.
That is the critical distinction we have to keep in mind. If you look at the last 50 years, you see this massive, measurable decline in trust. Trust in government, trust in media, corporations, everything. It's so easy to look at that and just say, well, people have lost their way.
Just blaming the individuals.
Right. But a systems thinker looks at that same data and asks, what changed in the design of the machine? If the output of a machine is cynicism and distrust, you have to look at the schematics. You don't just yell at the operator.
So let's unpack this core concept. The source defines the common good in a very structural way. It's not just a nice idea. Functionally, what is it?
Structurally speaking, the common good is a shared pool of trust and mutual obligation. The text actually references Edmund Burke, the 18th century philosopher who called it the general bank and capital of nations. So think of it as a reservoir.
A reservoir of trust.
Yes. Every time you follow an unwritten rule or every time you act with a little bit of forbearance, you make a deposit into that bank.
And we draw from that bank constantly, right?
All the time. It
Yeah.
creates this virtuous circle. The whole reason a complex society can function, the reason you and I can accept massive disruptions like new technology or international trade or demographic shifts, is because we implicitly trust that the bank is fully funded.
We trust that the system isn't going to unfairly burden us just to benefit a select few.
Exactly. We trust that if we take a hit for the team today, the team is going to have our back tomorrow.
It's the lubricant for the engine. Without that oil, the gears just grind to a halt. The argument here is that this substrate helps us manage the chaos of modern life. Because if I trust the system, I'm not terrified of change. But if I don't trust it, literally every change looks like an existential threat.
And that brings us to the structural progression we're going to use for this deep dive. We're going to examine the design of this trust, the incentives that shifted it, the outcomes of that shift, the persistence of the problem, and finally, interconnection.
Okay, let's start with the design layer, the institutional substrate. The author opens with a case study that I think perfectly captures the difference between formal written law and the common good. It's the story of Martin Shkreli.
Ah, yes, the farmer bro.
The farmer bro himself. And I want to dwell on this for a second because it's so easy to just remember the scandalous headline and completely miss the underlying mechanics. So for anyone who somehow missed this back in 2015, Shkreli was this young hedge fund manager who took over a pharmaceutical company.
Turin Pharmaceuticals, I believe.
Right. And he acquired the rights to a drug called Daraprim. Now, this was a 60-year-old drug. It was the standard life-saving treatment for a rare parasitic infection, which can be fatal for people with compromised immune systems like those with HIV or cancer. It costs $13.50 a pill. Shkreli bought the rights and literally overnight raised the price to $750 a pill.
A 5,000% increase.
Exactly, a 5,000% markup on a drug people needed to survive. And the public reaction was instantaneous and explosive. It was absolute revulsion. Shkreli became the most hated man in America, and he was hauled before Congress. But here is where it gets really fascinating from a systems perspective. What was his actual defense?
His defense was incredibly simple. He just sat there and said, I didn't break any laws.
And the terrifying part is he was right.
He was completely right.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate for a second here just to test the system boundaries. We live in a market economy. He bought an asset. He has investors to answer to. Isn't his fiduciary duty to maximize profit? If he can charge $750 and insurance companies or patients have to pay it because the alternative is death, then technically the market bears that price. Isn't he just doing his job as a capitalist?
If you view it entirely in a vacuum, yes. And that is precisely the vulnerability the source is pointing out. This is why the Martin Shkreli case is the ultimate study in institutional failure. His behavior shocks us, not because it was illegal, it wasn't, but because it completely violated the unwritten norms of the common good.
The unwritten rules?
Yes. There was an understanding, a soft norm in the pharmaceutical industry, that you do not hold dying people hostage for a 5,000% profit margin on a generic 60-year-old drug that you didn't even spend research money to invent. You are absolutely allowed to make a profit, but you don't gouge the vulnerable to the point of extinction.
But Shkreli didn't recognize soft norms. He only recognized hard laws. And if I remember the specifics correctly, he didn't just raise the price. He actively manipulated the regulatory structure. He created a closed distribution system so that generic competitors couldn't get their hands on the required samples to run bioequivalence tests. He essentially rigged the plumbing so the market couldn't even correct his pricing.
You weaponize the system's own rules against it. And this exposes the fatal flaw of the entire architecture. A system that relies entirely on written law without the substrate of unwritten moral norms is incredibly fragile.
Because you can't write a rule for everything.
Exactly. If you have to write every single rule down like, do not raise the price of Daraprim by 5,000%, or do not block generic testing samples, your trust is already dead.
Oh, yeah.
You simply cannot legislate every possible interaction between human beings.
It reminds me of those warning labels on coffee cups, caution, contents hot. The sheer fact that we have to write that down and print it on 1 million cups means common sense and trust have already failed. And the text brings up James Madison here regarding the Bill of Rights, which illustrates the self-enforcing nature of civic trust.
It's a profound structural insight. Madison argued that democracy is a coordination system. The Bill of Rights works not just because it's written on a piece of parchment, but because the citizenry implicitly trusts that others won't actively try to deprive them of those rights. It's a mutual non-aggression pact.
And think about the coordination costs if that pact fails.
They go through the roof. If I have to hire a private security guard to stand on my front lawn just to ensure my freedom of speech isn't physically stopped by my neighbor, the actual cost of living in that society skyrockets.
That is the failure mode. When trust evaporates, everything gets slower and more expensive. You need more contracts, more compliance officers, more lawyers, more security cameras. That inefficiency creates a massive drag on the whole system because nobody trusts anybody to just do the right thing anymore. It becomes a tax on every single interaction.
So Shkreli isn't just a villain in this analysis. He is a symptom. He represents the exact moment when the unwritten rules stopped mattering, and only the written rules counted. If it's not strictly illegal, it is permissible. That is a devastating shift in system design. It moves the goalposts from asking, is this right, to asking, can I get away with this?
Which leads us directly to the next structural layer, the incentives. Because if Shkreli is the body at the crime scene, we need to find the motive. So how did we move from a system designed for we, where there were strong enforcement expectations for unwritten rules, to a system optimized for me? What changed in the institutional reward structures?
This is the we to me transition.
Yeah.
And the source pinpoints this structural shift starting in the late 1970s. It's crucial to understand the context here. People didn't just wake up one morning and decide to be more selfish.
Right. The environment changed. Before the 70s, you had the generation that went through the Great Depression and World War II. There was this intense, forced interdependence. You literally could not survive those crises on your own. You needed the community. The cultural DNA was very much focused on the collective.
Right. The ethos was that we're all in this together. But by the time you hit the late 1970s, that memory is fading. You have the aftermath of the Vietnam War and Watergate, which severely eroded trust in national leadership. But economically, you also have stagflation. The economy is stagnant, inflation is high, the old we system seemed to be failing to deliver prosperity. People were feeling incredibly squeezed.
And when people feel squeezed, the survival instinct kicks in. They start looking out for themselves.
Exactly. And you start seeing very specific cultural signals popping up. The book mentions a huge bestseller from 1977 by Robert Ringer called Looking Out for Number One.
Which is such a blunt title.
It is. It extolled the virtues of selfishness as a positive good. It wasn't treated as a fringe or radical idea. It became mainstream self-help advice. The underlying message was that the world is full of suckers and you shouldn't be one of them. And then, jumping into the 80s, you have the film Wall Street. Gordon Gekko.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. I mean, Oliver Stone directed that movie as a critique of corporate culture, but for a whole generation in finance, it somehow became an instruction manual. They watched Gekko and thought, yeah, that's the guy I want to be.
That is the ultimate irony of that film. But underneath that pop culture layer, there was a very serious shift in the philosophical underpinnings of society. The source highlights the massive influence of thinkers like Ayn Rand and Robert Nozick. And we need to pause here because these aren't just obscure academic names. Their ideas became the new operating code for this era.
Let's unpack them because it's important to understand the actual arguments being made. We're just analyzing the ideas here. So with Ayn Rand, in the context of the 70s and 80s, why did her philosophy take such a strong hold on the institutional mindset?
Rand offered a comprehensive moral defense for selfishness. That was the core of objectivism. She argued that the only valid form of community is strictly voluntary association. In her framework, any obligation that you didn't explicitly and voluntarily sign up for was essentially a form of tyranny.
So if the government taxes me to pay for a public park or someone else's health care, and I didn't personally agree to that transaction, I am being wronged.
Exactly. In her view, the concept of the common good was essentially a myth. It was a manipulative tool used by the weak to exploit the productive and the strong.
You can see how seductive that idea is if you feel like you are the one carrying the burden, or if you feel the government is wasting your tax dollars. It totally flips the moral script. Suddenly, altruism is a vice that holds you back, and selfishness is elevated to a virtue.
And then Robert Nozick took that basic premise and gave it immense academic weight at Harvard. In his highly influential book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, he formulated a sophisticated philosophical argument that there is simply no such thing as a social good.
Wait, no social good at all?
Right. He argued that there are only individual people with individual lives. To talk about the good of society is a fundamental category error. Society doesn't exist as an entity that can experience good or bad, only individuals do. So he argued that if you try to create any pattern of fairness, like taxing wealth to fund public services, you are forced to constantly interfere with people's individual liberty to maintain that pattern.
So if you accept that premise that society is just an illusion and only the individual is real, then the entire concept of the common good just disintegrates. It becomes a mathematical impossibility.
It becomes a dangerous fiction. And this wasn't just a philosophical mood swing. It was a fundamental recoding of our societal incentives. Because if the individual is the only unit of value, then Martin Shkreli is completely rational. If maximizing individual gain is the only metric, then extracting profit at any cost is the right thing to do. Why on earth would you care about unwritten rules if they just act as speed bumps on your way to personal success?
All right, so we've established the design flaw, our heavy reliance on unwritten rules, and the incentive shift, which is this philosophy of individualism and selfishness. Now let's look at the outcomes, because this isn't just abstract philosophy, it actually changed how the machine works. How does this philosophy manifest in the machinery of society?
The source identifies 3 specific structural breakdowns. These are subsystem failures, where the we-to-me incentive structure caused a chain reaction.
Right.
We can categorize them into politics, corporations, and the broader economy.
Let's start with the first breakdown, politics. The phrase used in the analysis is whatever it takes to win. That feels incredibly relevant right now.
This marks the shift from governance to total war. In a healthy democratic system, there is a vital concept called forbearance. It's an unwritten rule that says just because you have the power to do something doesn't mean you should.
Can you give a concrete example of how forbearance used to work?
Sure. Think about the confirmation of judges or cabinet picks in the Senate. For a very long time, the soft norm was that you don't block a president's qualified nominees just because you can. You might fiercely disagree with their politics, but you respect the institutional right of the executive branch to staff its government. That was forbearance in action.
And now, how has that incentive shifted?
Now, the incentive is to block everyone. You use every single procedural weapon available to grind the opposition to a complete halt. If you have the leverage to shut down the entire federal government to extract budget concessions, you do it. The operating logic is now. If the written rules technically allow it, I must do it in order to win.
Because if you don't use every weapon, your base thinks you're weak. And more importantly, you assume the other side will use those weapons against you the second they get the chance. It's a total race to the bottom.
Exactly. Under the we to me ethos, forbearance is for suckers. If winning the next election is the only metric of value, then the integrity of the institution itself is treated as a disposable resource. You are willing to burn the institution to the ground just to win the cycle. We saw this escalate over decades, weaponizing the filibuster, government shutdowns, gerrymandering districts to absolute mathematical extremes. It is the exact same logic Shkreli used, just applied to the Capitol. I didn't break the law, I just used the rules to destroy my opponent.
And the ultimate casualty there is the public's faith that the government is actually trying to solve problems. When you watch that, it looks like a gladiator match, not a governing body. Okay, so that's politics. Let's move to the second breakdown. Corporations. This is the shift from whatever it takes to sustain the business to whatever it takes to maximize profits.
This is the historical pivot from stakeholder capitalism to shareholder capitalism.
We hear those terms thrown around a lot in business media, but walk us through the actual structural timeline here.
The contrast is really striking. In the 1950s and 60s, the prevailing institutional view was that a large corporation had a balance of responsibilities to multiple stakeholder groups. They had to answer to customers, to their employees, to the local communities they operated in, and yes, to their shareholders. It wasn't socialism by any means. It was just considered sustainable long-term capitalism.
The source uses a quote from Coca-Cola to illustrate this, right?
Yes. The text quotes the president of Coca-Cola in 1959 explicitly saying that management's job is to balance all these diverse interests. The logic was clear. If we mistreat our factory workers, the company ultimately suffers. If we pollute the local river, the community turns against us and the company suffers.
But then we fast forward to the CEO of Coca-Cola in 1988.
Roberto Goizueta. His quote is incredibly revealing. He said, and I'll paraphrase slightly, that he wrestles with how to build shareholder value from the time he gets up in the morning to the time he goes to bed. He said he even thinks about shareholder value while he is shaving.
That is a profound shift in mental energy, going from managing a delicate balance to an absolute single-minded obsession with the stock price. What drove that? Was it just personal greed on the part of executives?
No, it was a structural change in the market environment. The 1980s saw the explosion of corporate raiders, hostile takeovers, and the use of junk bonds people like Michael Milken. The incentives completely flipped.
Yeah.
If a company was sitting on cash reserves, or if it was treating its workers too well, which in this new logic meant spending money on wages that could be going to shareholders as dividends, a corporate raider would spot an inefficiency.
An opportunity to extract value.
Exactly. The raider would borrow a massive amount of money, execute a hostile takeover, fire the existing management, strip down the assets, lay off a huge chunk of the workforce, and artificially boost the stock price.
So the CEOs basically had a gun to their heads. It was maximize shareholder value or die. If I don't squeeze the workers and hollow out the community, some raider will just buy the company and do it anyway, and I'll be out on the street.
Precisely. It was a survival mechanism forced by a new winner-take-all incentive structure. And the measurable outcome was the complete severance of the corporation from its local community. Look at the data on compensation. We saw CEO pay rise from roughly 20 times the average worker's pay in the 1960s to nearly 300 times in recent years. The surplus that used to be shared with workers in the form of wages and with the community in the form of taxes and stability was aggressively funneled up to executives and shareholders.
Which brings us directly to the third breakdown, the economy, the mindset of whatever it takes to rig the system. And this one feels the most insidious because it largely happens behind closed doors. The source heavily emphasizes a document called the Powell Memo.
The Lewis-Powell Memo is essentially the origin point, the blueprint for this entire economic transformation.
Lewis Powell was a prominent corporate lawyer who was later appointed to the Supreme Court. What exactly did he write in this memo?
In 1971, he wrote a highly confidential memo addressed to the director of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. You have to put yourself in the mindset of corporate America at that exact moment. You had Ralph Nader aggressively attacking car safety standards. The Environmental Protection Agency was just being formed. Labor unions still had significant bargaining power.
So business leaders felt cornered.
Yes. Powell argued that the American free enterprise system was under broad, organized attack from consumer advocates and labor groups. He told the business community, in no uncertain terms, "You are losing this war because you aren't fighting back."
He essentially told them to weaponize their capital.
He urged them to mobilize their economic power into political power. He laid out a very specific long-term strategy. He said businesses needed to heavily fund think tanks, they needed a permanent army of lobbyists in Washington, and they needed to establish legal organizations to push a pro-business, anti-regulation agenda through the courts.
And looking back from where we sit today, it was a wildly successful strategy.
It worked flawlessly
Hmm.
because the mechanism is a perfect feedback loop. Corporate money translates directly into political influence. You fund a think tank to produce a polished white paper claiming that cutting corporate taxes will magically create jobs. You then hire lobbyists to push Congress to pass that exact tax cut. You contribute heavily to the campaign funds of the politicians who vote for it,
And then that tax cut gives your corporation even more money.
which you then use to lobby for further deregulation or to rewrite bankruptcy laws so they favor creditors over homeowners. It is not a static situation. It is a self-reinforcing cycle of accumulation and extraction. The rules of the economic game are constantly being rewritten by the winners to ensure that nobody else can catch up.
So just to recap where we are in the architecture, we have a political system that actively burns institutional trust to win the news cycle. We have a corporate system engineered to extract maximum value for shareholders regardless of the social cost. And we have an economic framework that uses its immense wealth to legally rig the rules. This brings us to Section 4, persistence. Why does the state of affairs stick around? How do these feedback loops actually deplete public trust?
This is where we have to look at economic inequality, not just as a dry statistic on a chart, but as an active system destroyer. We constantly hear that inequality is bad, but the source explains exactly why it breaks the machinery of civic cooperation. It cites a really revealing psychological study about air rage.
Oh, this study hit me so hard when I was reading the source material. It's by DeSales and Norton, and since I fly quite a bit, I could visualize the mechanics of this instantly.
Walk us through how they set it up.
So the researchers analyzed thousands of incidents of air rage. Passengers getting belligerent, yelling at flight attendants, getting into physical altercations. And they found that incidents of rage in the economy class increased significantly just by the mere presence of a first-class section on the plane. Even if nothing else changes, just knowing the inequality exists makes people more prone to aggressive behavior.
But the data gets even more specific regarding the physical environment.
Right. The rage incidents increase dramatically when the economy passengers are physically forced to walk through the first-class cabin to get to their seats in the back.
Think about the psychology of that physical experience.
You're shuffling down the aisle, carrying your heavy bag. You pass these massive, wide leather seats. The people there are already settled in. Maybe they're sipping a pre-flight drink. They have space. You might make eye contact, or they might just ignore you. And then you pass through the little curtain, and suddenly you're in the back. Your knees are crushed against the seat in front of you. You're fighting for a tiny sliver of overhead bin space.
That walk, that forced march through the premium cabin, is the physical manifestation of the American economy over the last 40 years. It generates a visceral, unavoidable sense of unfairness. It's not just simple jealousy. It's the profound realization that the game has completely different rules depending on where you sit.
And the study empirically shows that this feeling of structural unfairness rewires human behavior.
It does. The system insight here is that the high visibility of inequality breeds deep resentment, and that resentment actively reduces a person's willingness to cooperate with shared norms. If I feel the system treats me like cargo, while a select few are treated like royalty, why on earth should I follow the rules? Why should I be polite? Why should I comply?
Which leads directly to the collapse of trust as a depleted resource. The source uses Gallup poll data to track this, and the numbers are just a free fall.
It's a complete collapse.
Mm-hmm.
In 1964, over 60% of Americans trusted the federal government to do what is right most of the time. Today, that number hovers around 16%. In 1964, a strong majority believed the government was run for the benefit of all people. Today, the vast majority believe it is run by a few big interests looking out for themselves.
And it's not isolated to the government. We see similar crashes in trust for the media, the banking system, big business, even organized religion.
It's a systemic contagion, and this persistent low trust creates a phenomenon we can call rational opportunism. When the game is widely viewed as fundamentally rigged, then cheating actually becomes a rational survival strategy.
Break that down. How does opportunism become rational?
Think about paying taxes. If I fundamentally believe that everyone else in society is paying their fair share, I will pay my taxes. I might grumble, but I recognize it as the price of maintaining civilization. But if I read the news every single day and see that billionaires are legally paying zero income tax, or that multinational corporations are hiding profits in offshore tax havens, suddenly, me diligently paying my full tax bill doesn't feel like civic duty. It feels like I am being a sucker.
Right. The logic becomes, if the people at the top aren't following the spirit of the rules, why should I?
Exactly. If the elites, whether it's Skrelly or corporate raiders or politicians trading on inside information, are exploiting the system without facing any real consequences, the average citizen withdraws their compliance. You start to see an uptick in everyday rule-breaking, tax evasion, insurance fraud, petty theft. It is the contagion of cynicism.
Yeah.
And the feedback loop here is vicious. Low trust leads to opportunism, and that visible opportunism further destroys whatever trust is left.
It is a really bleak diagnostic picture, but the analysis doesn't stop at just the economic or political layers. It moves into Section 5, interconnection. Because you can't have a functional common good if you don't have a shared epistemic infrastructure, meaning we have to agree on reality.
This is critical. Democratic coordination absolutely requires a shared reality to function. We can passionately disagree on opinions, for instance. We could debate whether the top marginal tax rate should be higher or lower, but we cannot functionally debate whether the unemployment rate went up or down. We have to agree on the facts.
But the reality is we do disagree on facts now. The concept of alternative facts has entered the political bloodstream.
We do. And the source frames this as a form of intellectual treason. Truth-telling is a maintenance function for democratic systems. When political leaders intentionally disparage the very institutions designed to gather and verify truth, like scientific bodies, investigative journalism, academia, the courts, they are actively destroying the system's navigation tools.
It's like being the captain of a ship, and the compass is telling you that there are rocks straight ahead. But you don't like that fact because it makes you look bad, so you just smash the compass.
And the ship hits the rocks. You might feel powerful for a brief moment because you silenced the bad news, but you have destroyed your capacity to navigate reality. Truth is not a private commodity, it is a common good. It's an epistemic infrastructure. When you pollute the information ecosystem with intentional falsehoods just to win a news cycle, you are poisoning the well for the entire society.
The source connects this erosion of shared reality directly to our education systems, and this circles back perfectly to the public good versus private investment shift we talked about earlier.
This is a vital piece of the interconnection puzzle. Somewhere along the line, really accelerating through the 80s and 90s, we fundamentally changed how we view the purpose of education. The historical idea was that public education was a public good. We educate you so that you can be a capable, functioning citizen. So you can understand how to govern yourself, how to sit on a jury, how to critically analyze a complex ballot initiative.
Building civic capacity. And what is the new idea?
The new paradigm is education purely as a private investment. You go to college to get job training. You go to maximize your personal return on investment.
The message is just, go to a university so you can get a credential to make more money. It's no longer, go to university so you can understand constitutional law and participate in a democracy.
Exactly. We heavily pivoted to STEM and vocational training, which, to be clear, are economically vital. But in doing so, we completely hollowed out civic education. We stopped teaching the how of the system. We stopped teaching the unwritten obligations of citizenship. The source references Thomas Jefferson and the founders here. They were terrified of an uneducated public because they understood that a population without system literacy is incredibly susceptible to demagogues.
If you don't understand how the machinery of government actually works, you can't tell when someone is breaking it on purpose.
Or worse, you feel the pain of the breakdown, but you mistarget the reform. You feel the economic squeeze, you feel the unfairness of the first-class cabin, but because you lack the structural literacy, you blame the wrong things. You blame a vulnerable minority or you blame a vague conspiracy rather than understanding the actual structural incentives, the tax policies, the captured regulatory agencies, the campaign finance laws that are causing your pain. We have to teach people how to engage with reality outside their own bubbles.
Okay, so we have fully mapped the problem. The substrate of trust is cracked. The winner-take-all incentives are causing subsystem failures. The outcomes are generating massive inequality and resentment. And our shared reality is fracturing because we aren't maintaining our epistemic infrastructure. What is the stabilizing design pattern? The source talks extensively about leadership as trusteeship.
This is the corrective mechanism. But we have to be very precise here because trusteeship sounds like a generic corporate buzzword. The analysis differentiates trusteeship from ethics in a very structural way.
Let's define that difference. Because remember, Martin Shkreli claimed he was acting ethically. He said his actions were compliant with the law.
Exactly. In the modern corporate and political environment, ethics is essentially just the floor. Ethics means compliance. It means I technically followed the written law. I didn't embezzle money. I didn't commit blatant fraud. I stayed out of federal prison.
I didn't get indicted, therefore I am a good leader.
Right. But trusteeship is the ceiling. It is the understanding that when you hold office or corporate power, you are merely the temporary steward of an institution. Your fundamental obligation is to pass that institution on to the next generation in better shape than you found it.
It's the difference between strip mining a forest and managing a forest.
That is a perfect analogy. A strip miner is maximizing shareholder value in the short term. You cut down every single tree, you sell the timber, you show record profits for this quarter, but the forest is permanently gone.
The soil erodes, the ecosystem collapses, and there is nothing left for tomorrow.
But a trustee manages the forest. They harvest some trees to generate revenue, absolutely, but they replant. They actively ensure the soil remains healthy. They manage the ecosystem so that it can continue to produce timber and sustain life for another 100 years. That management is the common good in action.
And the source argues that leaders are actually trustees of the unwritten rules.
That is their primary governance function. A CEO or a politician acting as a true trustee actively refuses to win if winning requires destroying the credibility of the institution. You don't intentionally destroy public faith in the electoral process just to win one election. You don't gut the town that houses your workers just to bump the stock price for a single quarter. You steward the legitimacy of the system.
But let me push back on this, just testing the realism of it. Can a modern CEO actually afford to act like a trustee? If I'm running a publicly traded company and I announce, hey, we are going to maximize our margins this year because we are taking care of our community, won't the board of directors just fire me immediately and replace me with a Martin Shkreli type who will?
In the current system design, yes, they probably will. And that is exactly why this is a structural problem, not just a plea for better morals. The analysis makes it clear that we have to change the actual rules and incentives so that trusteeship is legally and financially rewarded and extraction is penalized. Maybe that means reforming corporate governance laws so boards are legally required to consider stakeholders, not just shareholders. Maybe it means strict campaign finance reform. You cannot just ask people to act like saints in a system that is mathematically designed for sharks.
Which brings us to the core question we always have to ask at the end of these deep dives. Synthesizing everything we've just unpacked, what is the crisis in perception here?
The fundamental crisis in perception is that we are looking at a massive structural failure and misperceiving it as a sudden epidemic of bad character. We perceive the decline of society as a problem of bad apples. We think that if we just vote out the corrupt politicians or if we just jail the greedy CEOs, the system will naturally fix itself.
We are obscuring the structural layer by focusing entirely on individual morality.
Exactly. The structural reality is that we have meticulously designed an environment where exploiting the common good is the mathematically optimal strategy for the individual. If the incentive architecture relentlessly rewards me at the expense of we, then perfectly rational actors will destroy the we. The surface scandals, the Shkrelists, the corporate raiding, the political paralysis, those aren't glitches. They are the predictable output of a system functioning exactly as it is currently incentivized.
We fail to see trust, legitimacy, and shared reality as infrastructure.
Yes, we treat trust like it's the air we breathe, infinite, free, and indestructible. But it's not. It's like a bridge or a power grid. It is a depletable resource that requires constant, intentional maintenance. And right now we are deferring that maintenance.
It really connects all these nested systems together. The economic concentration creates the capital to capture the political system. The captured political system rewrites the regulatory enforcement capacity. Those rigged rules accelerate inequality. That inequality breeds deep civic resentment. And because we've hollowed out our educational systems, citizens lack the structural literacy to see how the platform-mediated attention economy is manipulating that resentment.
That is the complete systems view. You cannot solve the problem of trust by just passing a single policy or demanding better ethics, you have to rebuild the substrate. You have to actively redesign the incentives that drive the behavior.
And structural clarity is always the first step. You
Yeah.
cannot fix a machine if you fundamentally misunderstand how the gears turn. And I think this analysis gives us a much better schematic to work from.
It's going to be the central challenge of this generation. But seeing the erosion of the common good clearly as a design flaw to be engineered, rather than a moral failing to just lament, is the only way we begin to restore it.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.